Every single game during a 12-game season can feel like a big game. We've been in the spotlight. We have the big game experience. We know what it takes in crunch time to get it done.
We are really battle-tested. This team knows how to win. We've proven that for the past 3 years.
Obviously, they're still very talented. They've got a lot of good pieces, and I like the trajectory that we're on.
Straight on three, 1, 2, 3.
Jordan Kerr flipping it into the end zone. A crescendo there. The New York championship train just keeps on rolling.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass Week 10 preview pod coming at you. I am Adam Ruffner. That is Cameron Brock. We've got a rematch of the 2023 championship game on deck between the 7-1 Salt Lake Shred going to visit the 6-3 two-time reigning champion New York Empire on Saturday's much anticipated Super Series matchup, live and free on the UFA YouTube channel, but the action doesn't even get close to stopping there. We've also got a scintillating Game of the Week matchup on Friday between two interdivisional first place teams, with the 6-1 Carolina Flyers going to visit the 8-2 DC Breeze. The Breeze have already clinched their 2024 playoff spot. Carolina coming off of their first loss of the season against the Hustle in Atlanta. They're looking to bounce back as well as possibly punch their postseason ticket as well. In the Central Division, the two top teams, Minnesota and Chicago, will also meet. Madison, Indianapolis, Colorado, Seattle, Atlanta, Austin, Oakland, and San Diego all having crucial matchups for their potential playoff spots. Cameron, Week 10, I feel like is going to be a real pretenders and contenders kind of separating the wheat from chaff moment, where we have 12 playoff spots available. The 3 in the East have already been claimed by Boston, DC, and New York, but the other 9 are still completely up in the air at the moment. And while we have a certain sense of who's going to fall in where, Week 10 is really going to be the deciding factor in my mind.
Yeah, it's a really interesting week because depending on the results, we could see a clear line of demarcation of here are the contenders and here are the pretenders. And as has been the case all year, with this being the chaos season, as you've dubbed it, we could leave this weekend still not knowing who the contenders and pretenders are, because it still just might be a muddled mess. So I've said this on the pod before, and I'll continue to say it, especially in the Central. I just don't think we're really going to know who's making the playoffs until the last week of the season for a lot of these teams. Although I will say, obviously in the East, we have our playoff teams locked in. In the South, we're pretty close to having our playoff teams locked in. And in the West, while we don't really know the seeding, we have a pretty good idea of the 3 teams that are going to make the playoffs. So it'll be interesting because, as we talked in the pre-show, especially out west, Colorado still technically alive, but they just got to keep winning. So wins by the other teams going for the playoffs, a loss by Colorado pretty much ends their season. So there is still a little bit of tension out there. And, Colorado's not dead until they're dead, right?
They are not dead until they are dead. And I think that's a very apt thing to say about the Summit, given their levels of talent and given the fact that with Quinn Finer back in the lineup this past weekend, it really sort of stabilized their offensive possessions and drives. I feel like we might get into a little bit more of critique later on. I might ask you to divulge some of the film study that you've been doing of Colorado, given that you guys have an upcoming Super Series matchup
Sure.
in Colorado against the Summit. And I think you have some really interesting findings that I would absolutely concur with about Colorado's defense, especially in the post-Cody Spicer era. But that's a little bit more on the back burner, given the kinds of top-level Titan matchups we have heading into Week 10. And I just feel like we've got to launch right into it. The Super Series showdown between Salt Lake and New York. This is as much of an anticipated game as any we've seen in 2024. I know we've had a lot of them to this point, but there's both the championship rematch element, which I think is the main driving force between these two teams, where Salt Lake is looking to get any kind of revenge after their pretty humiliating loss in the title game in 2023 when they went down 8-2 immediately in the opening quarter and were just never able to make a game of it from then. Salt Lake entered this year with a renewed kind of passion. It felt like they were really going to be trailblazing towards possibly hosting championship weekend at the end of August of this year. And yet, with the loss to Colorado, who has kind of had a sort of big brother-like presence at times with the Shred, and with them sustaining, not so quietly, a number of pretty significant injuries, particularly to that offense, with Will Selfridge still possibly being sidelined for a fourth straight game this weekend, as well as Jordan Kerr being sidelined last weekend, almost in a precautionary way, to monitor and address his broken, non-throwing hand that will be a major factor in this matchup going into New York. I say all of this to say Salt Lake, to me, is still one of the most impressive teams in the entire 2024 campaign. I absolutely consider them to be the favorite coming out of the West. I do think that we will see them in a championship game matchup at the end of the season. But with New York looking resurgent in recent weeks, given that they will have possibly their strongest active roster to this point in the season, especially given the way that Ben Yot has been elevating in recent weeks, Elliot Chartok and Oliver Chartok have been taking off in recent games. Jack Williams is still Jack freaking Williams in every start. This could be a pretty big, I think, emotional setback for Salt Lake, given the non-championship sort of intangible elements going into this matchup. And I think that starts with, we've got to mention it, the triple spike last year, which is just sort of, again, emblematic of the kind of bravado and confidence that New York plays certain opponents with. And I expect the reigning champs to have that kind of edge going against the Shred this weekend.
I want to see the triple spike part 2. Which you could argue we already did with Alex Atkins, but I want to see it specifically in this matchup. And, could be from Salt Lake, I guess. I have a weird feeling going into this game. So the Empire are pretty close to full strength. They are down Solomon Rushmeyer-Bailey and probably down John Randolph. But one of the big stories that came out, especially of championship weekend, was Antoine Davis essentially eliminating Jordan Kerr from the game. And now we have a Jordan Kerr who's really going to be playing essentially one-handed. Antoine Davis is right there. I'm sure he's going into this matchup with some confidence after what he was able to do last year in their 2 matchups. I don't know enough about the health of Jordan Kerr and his hand to give any really informed opinion, but to me, it seems silly to even put him out there in this game. I hope he plays well. I hope nothing happens to further the injury or delay the timetable of how long it would take to heal. But for being an out-of-division game that largely probably wouldn't factor into the standings out west, it seems like an emotional decision to me. I think, again, this is me being away from the team, not having all the information. But it just seems weird to me that he didn't play last week and all of a sudden he's ready to play this week. It almost feels like they want to try to go out and prove something, specifically after the only 2 games they lost last year were to New York. I don't know. That's the matchup I'm going to be looking at because it was such a pivot point in the matchup last year with Antoine Davis's amazing coverage that I want to see. Are there adjustments made? Do they run sets that allow Kerr to get the disc in his hands more than he was able to last year?
Yeah, I mean, you figure with the kind of injury, they might be making him more of a passer than sort of a stretch the field dynamic playmaker as he's been in his first 2.5 seasons with this Shred franchise. But knowing the kind of competitor that Kerr is, I wouldn't be surprised to see him almost taking advantage a little bit of a New York defense that might think he's a little bit limited in his capabilities. I could see him taking an opportunistic route deep and finding a little bit more space in the downfield area But to your point, I think that I largely agree with you that it's a little bit risky to be running him out there this weekend for this particular game. But I will say not so fast on this interdivisional matchup not being of importance for Salt Lake. And that's because it tethers to Seattle, who is sitting only a half game behind the Shred. And they do have a remaining matchup with Salt Lake this season that will be the first and only meeting between those two teams to possibly decide a home field playoff game as well as a first round bye into the West Division Championship game. And I've got to tell you, I think if Salt Lake ends up playing on the road in a championship game for the West Division title, that could be a big hurdle for them hosting championship weekend, possibly 2 weekends after that.
No, I completely agree. It just feels weird to me that he didn't play last week at all, and now he's playing this week. And I get it, there's a week in between, but we also know that he had the cast on last week. He has the cast on this week. So I guess what's the difference to me? That's why this feels like a weird decision to me. It feels emotional because I don't think the status of his hand changed from last week to this week. He had the cast on then, he has the cast on now. I don't really know what the point was unless they just went into that LA game thinking we're going to beat LA whether Jordan Kerr's on the field or not.
I think I've heard some rumblings that there is waiting for a specific doctor clearance before he can get back on the field, which I think was part of the hesitancy in playing him this last weekend. I also think, to your point earlier, it's just precautionary. Of all the matchups that they could afford to miss, it's probably the one against a one-win LA team right now.
Yeah, a one-win LA team down, one of their primary throwers. Makes sense. Now, as far as the matchup goes, I do think Salt Lake they're still going to miss Will Selfridge, right? We talked about the NOS boost he can be to this offense. I think they are just a different team out there when he's on the field. And we saw what this Empire defense was able to do to the Shred offense last year. Now, they did obviously have John Randolph out there. They had Jeff Babbitt playing D-line points at championship weekend. That being said, even without those guys, I think that they can be largely successful against the Salt Lake offense again. Especially as you mentioned, Ben Yacht has, as the season has gone on, become more like Ben Yacht. Early on in the season, it really looked like he had just hit a wall. It was very stark. Like it caught me completely off guard. But we have seen as they've made adjustments to their offensive personnel, and for the better, obviously, that it seems like Ben Yacht has really come alive and really become, somebody you have to watch out for again, after kind of being a little bit middling in his first couple of games of the season. I'm excited too, because he's the guy who did the triple spike, right? They literally put a rule in the rule book that, for this year, that we in Indy, as we were studying the new rules, we just call it the Ben Yacht rule, which is that you can't integrity an unsportsmanlike, which is what happened last year. It got integrity and turned over by...
Shout out to Bryce Merrill. Shout out to the reigning coach of the year, Bryce Merrill. I think everyone can agree that was one of the most... He got that dog in a moment of being like, no, bring him back out here. He's sucking cans of gas. I want him back out in this field. And even though Salt Lake ended up losing that game, I love that kind of competitive fire of, hey man, if we're gonna lose against your best roster. I want no excuses in this matchup.
So we call that the Ben Yacht rule, because that's obviously the impetus for that. I do worry a little bit about New York's offense without Solomon Rushmere-Bailey. They've been fine when they've had to replace him. This isn't the first game he's missed. But when you're going up, obviously, against top tier competition, in every little bit counts, right? So not having him, not having John Randolph, that could be the difference, right? Because one thing about their D-line last year that made them so oppressive was two guys that aren't there anymore. And so you look at it from two ways. Jeff Babbitt was on defense for championship weekend for the most part, along with obviously John Randolph. And during the regular season, instead of Jeff Babbitt, it was Ben Yacht on defense. Of course, we know he'll be playing offense. So down two guys that were so integral to like stopping Salt Lake's offense. I do wonder now. Again, Salt Lake is going to have probably a slightly different version of Jordan Kerr, and Will Selfridge isn't out there. So I'm not sure what gives more, right? Like, is it the defense that suffers more for New York? Is it the offense that suffers more from Salt Lake in this situation? I'm not really sure, but the way the Empire have like fought through this season and made adjustments and just kind of continued to look better and better every week. And now they're hosting this game. Granted, it's not in New York. It's in Hartford? Is that right? I can't remember. But I really think I favor New York in this game, despite the Shred being at one point the team that we thought was maybe the best team in the league.
So I feel like I need to self-correct, as I often have to do on this show. I mentioned that it is one of the strongest lineups for New York this season, and I still attend to that. But to your point, John Randolph was switched today from active to doubtful due to a concussion, it looks like, listed on the injury report, which is a very serious development, I feel like, for one of the top 4 players on New York's roster and one of the most linchpin playmakers that they have on either offense or defense. I mean, remember earlier this season in that first matchup with Montreal when they had to kind of safety valve him onto the O-line and make sure that he was a part of some of their most crucial possessions? He's been so central to this team's successes in a bedrock way over the past 2 seasons now, because he joined midway in 2022. He's out, and to your point about Solomon Rushmeyer-Bailey, who's now going to be missing another game, we're not as up to date on what exactly his absence is due to, but he will not be able to be in the backfield for New York. He has been one of the top 3, I would say, reset centerpiece handlers in the entire league over his tenure with New York over the past couple seasons. It's like him, Andrew Roy, Matt Guccio-Hannes, who's no longer with the Flyers, but those are kind of the prototypical examples I'd love to give for, if you're starting a backfield unit and need someone just to complete a high volume of throws, this is the guy you want. I'll also throw in Luke Jorgensen from Salt Lake. He's been fantastic for them as being kind of that pivot swing handler who gets the disc sideline to sideline and maybe doesn't always get the credit he deserves for setting up so much of what the offense does well. But SRB has been one of the most important backfield decision makers in this league. He won't be available. And yet at the same time, I think I agree with you. I think that in this matchup, given all the various factors, I favor New York at home, particularly in this midday matchup. It's going to be a 1 p.m. Eastern start time, which is just an odd place for a travel team to get ready for. And I think you can almost speak to this as an athlete. You guys are so finely tuned as far as sort of the regimentation and the timing of when these games take place, that when you shift something several hours ahead of when you normally sort of activate your body, it can be a real different experience for you out there in the field.
100%. And it can be, it's just a change, right? Like, it's out of your routine. Like, our home games here in Indy, like, every home game starts at 6:30. Like, our owners do a great job of making sure our start times are consistent throughout. And generally speaking, all of our games start between like either at 6:30 or 7. And that's great. Like, you kind of you have everything timed out perfectly, right? You know when to eat your meals, what you're eating, when you're eating, when you need to take care of whatever. And then when you move something significantly up, right? Like, it does change a lot, especially because think about a 1 p.m. start. Like, do I eat lunch? Like, what? Like, I'm probably getting to the field by 11, and then like team warmups are probably starting at like noon. Like, you got to kind of reconfigure, and they're making a long trip across the country too. I mean, I assume they're getting in the night before, but depending on when flights get in, like, that can be tricky too. Like, it's just weird, and I think that gives a little, like, even more of an edge for New York, right? Like, just little things like that are so much harder, especially like you see it in other sports. Like, the travel from the west to the east is always much harder than going the other way.
Yeah, I mean, because again, you're kind of activating your body a few hours ahead of when it's normally getting up to speed. And again, that's such an importance of, I feel like, high level sports performance is just getting things down to a specific time that you're used to and when you're getting into rhythm. And so a Salt Lake team that often relies on that as sort of an MO to operate from, like, that's going to be a challenge to overcome. But if there is a team to sort of handle that kind of hurdle, I feel like it's a team coached by Bryce Merrill and this amazing Salt Lake coaching staff that just seems to be able to understand the both strategic implements that they need to address in a given matchup, as well as the rest of the sort of mania that surrounds any given game, and especially one that's going to be showcased in this way and is such an anticipated matchup. I feel like this is something that they've been talking about since before the season began, about this being a sort of game that's going to have a lot of varying factors that are going to contribute outside of the individual one-on-ones that each player is going to face, which is already going to be a tremendous task, again, given the sort of players that are rostered on both the Empire and the Shred.
I'm curious. I mean, I guess your power rankings just came out, so like I guess I could just reference those. But but also, like, where are you with Salt Lake right now? Like your power rankings, right? You give a little like 4 or 5 sentences on each team, but like if you were to espouse about them a little bit more, I guess, because I think I mentioned this before, maybe a couple weeks ago, but they're a team that early on in the season we're like, yep, this is Salt Lake. They're top dogs. And, you know, they had some close games that you're like, well, you know, they're kind of close in some of these games, but they're still winning. And, you know, and just, I don't know where I'm at with them right now. I still think they're incredibly talented. I still think that they're a great team, but like, I just don't have the same view of them that I did. I guess I'm not as starry-eyed about them as I was early in the season.
Yeah, I wrote about a couple weeks ago in the power rankings, weeks ago in the power rankings, about how one of my big questions was, did they peak too early? Which is something that's happened before in this league. It's a danger, I think, in any kind of sport, which is simply getting a little too activated too early and not being able to sustain that kind of competitive edge throughout a season that is quite long and taxing. Again, we don't often get into like the heuristics and the meta element of scheduling in the pro leagues versus, say, club or the amateur divisions in college, where you sort of have these spread out tournaments that allow you a little bit more, I think, levity as far as when and where your focus is. Whereas this week in, week out churn in the UFA just sort of flattens aspirations at a certain point. Like, you have to be able to sort of throttle yourself through a season and not get overly excited or overly expected too soon. And I do worry a bit about that with the Shred. I do think that you had that season opening win against DC. You've got Will Selfridge looking like it's his coming out game as a true star. You've got the whole offense kind of clicking. And yet it's sort of been a slow, gradual descent from that point. You know, that's been their now most impressive win of the season. And it's 9 weeks in the past at this point. And, you know, their most recent sort of contentious battle was a home loss to Colorado on June 8th. They haven't really played much this month, the Shred have. You know, their lone win against LA, you know, they've played 2 games since May 25th. And so I think there is a challenge for the Shred team to keep their heads level, to understand that there are still a lot of very pressing challenges ahead of them. And again, I give all the credit in the world to Salt Lake's organization for preparing their players for it. But the simple fact of the matter is the reality is going to be much tougher than whatever they prepare for. And I think that this weekend is going to be a real telltale battle as far as what sort of competition level can the Shred team actually elevate to? Because after how they performed in that championship game against New York last year, where they came out just completely flat and almost scared against the reigning champs, I'm a bit worried.
Yeah, and I mean, they didn't look great in their semifinal game, right? They were a miracle play by Joel Clutton away from not even making it to the championship game after being, the clear favorite to go face New York. Yeah, so I do wonder. I think this week will tell me a lot, right? It'll tell me a lot about Salt Lake. I think it'll also tell me a lot about New York and where they're at. I hope Salt Lake proves me wrong, right? I'm worried about them, especially down Will Selfridge. I'm just kind of worried about the state of their team right now. They've had, while they're winning games, and winning games is always a good thing, some of these results you would like to see be a little bit more lopsided in their favor. Like even this LA game last weekend, I know they were down Jordan Kerr and Will Selfridge, but like they let LA kind of hang around. Like
they struggled to get separation on LA. They really did.
And you look at their 2 San Diego games, like San Diego's been punchy and they've been in most of their games, but like Salt Lake was supposed to be the class of this division. You look at the collapse that they had against Colorado, where they were up 4 goals in the fourth quarter and got out, just got handled. It's just like all these things that are creeping up. It does seem like there was so much excitement and build up for that first game against DC. And we have not really, outside of their game in Colorado, and maybe you could make an argument for their game at Oakland. Outside of like those 3 games, I just don't feel like I've seen that same Salt Lake team in any other game this season. And that worries me a little bit. Now, like you said, the season can be kind of a slog. You do have to get up for every single game. This isn't club where you can just kind of like, hey, it doesn't really matter that much if we win or lose.
Off round, bye round.
Yeah.
This tournament doesn't factor in heavily to the algorithm.
Yeah.
It's early season. A loss is a loss in the UFA.
Yep. So like all of those things, it can be hard. So maybe this is a lot to do about nothing, right? Or a lot of ado about nothing. Maybe they get to the playoffs and they just turn it back on, and this conversation seems really silly. But I feel like when you see teams that win championships, this isn't what happens during the season, right? Like we're coming off obviously of an all-time, maybe the all-time great team. Well, I'm going to go say the all-time great team, which is that New York Empire dynasty that won 31 straight games, which the dynasty's not dead yet, right? Not until they lose. So if they don't lose, right? And the thing was, they went out and performed even when teams gave them a good game, you never felt like it was because New York was like going down to the level of their opponent. You felt like the opponent was playing up to the level of New York.
Great point. Yeah.
And I think that's the difference, right? I feel like I've seen Salt Lake play down to opponents that they should be winning games easily against, and instead they're, winning by 2 or 3 goals. And that does not scream championship mentality and championship team to me. And I think the other thing is they have some absences, and like Will Selfridge, I think is a notable absence who's been gone for 4 straight games. And like that's a real thing, but like every team deals with absences. Even the teams that win championship, even New York
has dealt with some of the most absences of any team this league. I mean, 2 weekends ago at Philadelphia, they were on a complete skeleton roster and still managed to gut out that comeback win on the road.
Yeah. So it's just, I want to see that same thing from Salt Lake. I want to see them perform even in not ideal conditions. I want to see them look like a championship team when it's hard to look like a championship team. And I feel like we've only seen that in spots this year. We have not seen it consistently.
You know who Salt Lake reminds me of just a little bit? The Madison Radicals teams of old, when they
I was
made
about to
6
say
straight
the team
championship
that
weekends.
gets blown out by the then Raleigh Flyers at home before loses to us in Indy before going on and just like destroying everybody at championship weekend.
Yeah, a little bit. And just that kind of tentativeness against certain levels of competition. There is still an aspect of the Shred roster that, aside from Grant Lindsley, there isn't a whole bunch of experience throughout the rest of the roster in big matchups in important situations. And that's just a fact of the matter. Where on the flip side, you have this New York team that most of their roster has played in multiple championship games and won them. Outside of that, a lot of them have been college champions and existed in the top realms of the elite divisions of club. And again, with Salt Lake and Utah Ultimate in general, this is a project that they're undertaking to prove that they belong at this level, but it hasn't quite reached that level yet.
I don't know. It's the Super Series game for a reason. It's a big one. I actually love that it's a 1 p.m. game because that means I can watch it before I actually leave to go to my game. I don't leave my house until around 3:15 on game day, so that game should just be wrapping up around the time I'm taking off. So that'll be nice. I'm sure it'll get my competitive juices flowing too. But Salt Lake, show me something. Show us all something.
You wanted to see something from Salt Lake, and I feel like 22 other franchises want to as well, because I wrote it in my power rankings. If New York gets this win, that feels like a big step up back into their sort of mojo possessed realm where they just can then go on a run from that point. Like, they experienced their first 2 losses in a row since the 2018 season earlier in their 2024 calendar. But if they get a 3rd straight win against what is supposed to be their challenger in the Salt Lake Shred, and Ben Yacht's coming on, and Jack Williams is as stable as ever, and Elliott and Oliver Chartok are elevating into their increased roles, and they get Solomon Rushmeyer-Bailey back, and Antoine Davis and Marquez Brownlee and Brenton Tan all start to lead this defensive unit. Like, it could be a real quick turnaround from where we were questioning New York to begin this season to the reigning champs are back. The reigning champs are looking good again. Watch out, everyone.
Yeah, and in some of these games, Jack Williams has really stepped up recently to Jack's great. Playoff Jack's the best, but regular season Jack's not bad either. He's that layout Callahan he had, was that a couple weeks ago?
Ben Yacht is quick to remind everyone, playoff Jack doesn't exist. It's just Jack Williams, which I also agree with. It's just fun to talk about playoff Jack, given his couple of runs through the postseason.
I get what they're saying. Like he always plays great, but there's there's just something about playoff Jack. You can't tell me.
The buzzer beaters, man. Let's just get out right and say it. Like, the guy has a handful of buzzer beaters to eliminate teams in the postseason. Like, that's just not something really anyone else has on their resume in this league.
Yeah, he's that guy.
He is that guy. Can't wait to tune in and watch that game again on UFA YouTube at 1 p.m. Eastern on Saturday. But I do want to get into the rest of the Week 10 games we've got to talk about on this episode. And most notably, I think, the game of the week on Friday night between 6-1 Carolina and 8-2 DC. So there's just been a lot of different episodes in this rivalry over the past few seasons that I think makes it one of the most tantalizing matchups in this league. And in particular in this matchup, I think it's really interesting because, as I said at the top of the show, both teams occupy the top spots in their respective divisions. And so an interdivisional loss would be a real hard pill to swallow for either of these teams that are looking for really needing kind of a playoff home game as well as a potential first round bye, given the kinds of competition that they face. Carolina with Atlanta, most notably, but also Austin, who was last year's South Division champion. And then in the East, DC's got Boston and New York to somehow work through in their bracket.
Yeah, last year there was the Joe White game, as I like to call it.
Whew, that was something, man.
Joe White.
The Joe White hot game, as I like to call it.
Yeah, the inside backhand, inside backhand, inside backhand.
Well, to be fair, he started it against DC that night, but then he had the basically controller spam, like you're playing your little brother in Street Fighter or something, the next night in Philadelphia, where he went 5 straight IO air bounce backhands in a row.
Yeah,
Great
and
stuff.
they
Great
played
stuff.
twice last year too, which was they did a game in Carolina, a game in DC. They split them. Actually, the road team won both games.
Yeah.
And yeah, this will be a fun one because I think it's a great measuring stick too for both of these teams. We have seen Carolina, take care of business against Atlanta twice at home, but both of those games, Atlanta was missing significant pieces, and we saw what happened in Atlanta when both teams were mostly at full strength without any like major pieces missing, and Atlanta really kind of took it to them. You mentioned the scheduling thing earlier too, for when we were talking about the New York and Salt Lake game, and the battle testing that Atlanta went through, I think has really served them well. And obviously, as they've just like gotten better and better every week, and I feel like the Flyers finally kind of getting a true, like real, like really good game, from a really good Atlanta team last week. I think that's going to be something that they're going to try to get that bad taste out of their mouth, right? They had not lost until last week, and they had looked like the best team in the league for a lot of this season. Going to DC to face a really good Breeze team, it's really interesting to me. Also, because the East, like we have the 3 playoff teams. Boston actually kind of has the inside track on the top seed. They are currently second in the standings, but they've played less games than DC, and that's kind of the holdup. And they have an easier schedule remaining than DC does, obviously, with this Flyers game that the Breeze are about to play. I really love when we get to see top teams from different divisions play each other and kind of see where that power kind of lines up. It was the big appeal to the first game of the season, right? Having Salt Lake and DC, 2 top teams from different divisions playing against each other. Same thing going on here. We've had a lot of cross-division games this year, and we've got a couple of really good ones this week where we're seeing, teams that are going to be in the playoffs and kind of where they match up against each other right now. Especially because, once we get to the playoffs, only one team gets to go to championship week from each division. So we don't always get to see these matchups play out. What are your thoughts going into this game? I do see a couple of notable absences from the Flyers, but I also see a couple notable ones for the Breeze. So I don't really know who got the best out of that.
I was going to say they're both pretty strong rosters, but to your point, there are some very eye-catching absences. In Carolina, Saul Yannick and Ethan Bloodworth will not be available in this matchup. And Clint McSherry is currently listed as questionable. He's now was demoted from active to questionable given an illness. And he's been one of the captains. He was who I was forgetting, and we were talking the other day in our Week 9 recap, the captainship alongside William Coffin and Trevor Lynch. The third one was Clint McSherry. And then for DC, you've got Tyler Monroe out, who I think behind Cole Jurek and Andrew Roy has been the most impressive player for DC this season. I mean, he just kind of gets everything that he wants in any given one-on-one matchup. He was the goal receiver in their walk-off win against Philadelphia a few weeks ago. He's one of those guys who's just kind of impossible to figure out how to entirely slow down or solve. It feels like he's going to get his 4 to 5 scores, around 300 yards, and 95 completion percentage on 20 plus throws every single game he goes out there. And so to just have that kind of production not available for them, I'm interested to see for DC against a quality opponent like Carolina. But given who else is available for both teams, this really isn't going to be a matchup lacking of any kind of firepower.
Oh, true.
And so to me, what this matchup comes down to is, can the Carolina offense show, after what Atlanta did to it, that they can get back on track and not get disrupted in their continuation game, which is what I felt like the Hustle did so effectively against the Flyers. They really limited Youngst and Laviolette and even Fairfax to a certain extent about being throwers in that continuation space. And it just sort of disrupted the entire fast break offense, running downhill at you approach that the Flyers like to take. I think DC has the kind of defenders capable of doing that against Carolina, but DC has struggled at times this year to entirely slow down the opposition. I think that the absences of some of their starting defenders from the 2023 season, most notably in like Alexander Fall and Troy Holland, has really sort of had ramifications in their rotations, especially a little bit further down in their matchup identification, where they're simply not able to control 1 through 7 in the way that they have been in the past. Mm-hmm. And so that's, I think, where the purchase point is. Can Carolina's offense show what it has been through the first 6 games before Atlanta disrupted it? And can DC's defense get another good performance against a quality offense? Because other than their game against New York, where they held the Empire to just 14 goals, there hasn't really been a notable effort against a top flight elite offense for the Breeze this season.
Yeah, and even like calling New York's offense this year top flight elite, I think would be a stretch.
Well, I would hold off there. They're still one of the most efficient offenses in the league this year. What are they at right now? They're third in offensive success rates. So I know it's kind of fallen down a few notches from where we're used to seeing the Empire, but I don't think you can entirely knock them, given they're more just mortal than not elite.
I guess that's fair. I actually see the Flyers having a lot of success here. I think kind of for the reasons you mentioned, like I just don't think they have the depth on that defensive line to just take care of everyone, because that's the thing. They're one of those offenses where you do have to worry about all 7 guys in the field all the time, and I just don't think they match up super well with that Flyers offense too. What Atlanta was able to do to them is unique. I think Atlanta's D-line, I know, like, statistically, I don't think they're, like, the top defense, like, if you go down all the metrics, right? But, like, the eye test with Atlanta's defense, especially given the competition they've played against, like, really impressive. I would actually not be surprised if by the end of the season, because they have, I think, a Houston and a Dallas game coming up that they haven't played yet. I would not be surprised if they ended the season as the top-ranked defensive team after they get some of those easier games on their schedule after they've played such a crazy schedule going up to this point. And I just don't think the Breeze really have that sort of defense where they can just kind of where they're going to be able to create as much chaos and as much difficulty for this Flyers offense. I think last week was a one-off. I would even say, like, if they were going up against Atlanta again, I think Carolina would make adjustments and figure out ways to get some of those kinks out of their offense. I think they're too talented, they're too well coached to not figure those things out. That being said, the Breeze do have some capable guys on defense, and they do have some pieces, right, that can really, on a turnover, work it and go score, which we saw the Flyers had a lot of trouble stopping Atlanta's D-line from going and converting breaks. So if they do struggle and if they do turn the disc over, they're going to need to show a little bit more fight than they did last week, where they gave up 70-something percent conversion from the Atlanta D-line. Like, they can't do something like that again, because if they do that against DC, the game's going to be over. Like, DC plays a slower style anyways. The points are going to be limited compared to an Atlanta offense that moves the disc quickly and is one of the best hucking teams in the league. That's not where you're going to see from DC. The game's going to be more drawn out. The point totals are going to be lower. So that just means that every time they get an opportunity to break you, it is that much more impactful, because there's going to be less opportunity for you to make that up on the back end of the game.
Yeah, and to your point about DC's conservatism on offense, the team has not attempted more than 10 hucks in a game in each of their last 5 games, and they have just 3 instances in their 10 total games of attempting double-digit hucks. I mean, this is the team more than anyone else in the league that loves to just rely on their throwing talent and their ability to sort of beat you in any individual matchup and switch the field and switch the marks and attack from any position on the field, that just makes them a really hard out. And that is why the Breeze have the highest offensive success rate in the league this season, and why they've been the most consistent offensive unit over the past 4. This is the system of DC, and Lauren Boyle deserves so much credit in her first year as head coach, taking over the sort of framework that Daryl Stanley put in place and just continuing to run with it. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And I feel like that's been one of the best parts about watching Boyle take over the reins of this team, is not getting carried away with making her own imprint on it, but simply elevating what was already there for this very successful Breeze franchise. And I think that you've really seen that in 2024, where they've had a lot of turnover. They lost their best offensive player over the past year, with Christian Boxley sitting out this year with Worlds games and everything else, and trying to sort of load manage the expectations of elite athletes in this sport. And yet, despite that, the Breeze are having their most successful offensive season in their franchise's history. And so I think that that's a really big credit to both, obviously, the personnel involved and all the players on the field, but to the coaching staff as well, that they continue to push forward what you're saying, that this sort of approach of grind it out, trust that we're always going to sort of hold the advantage as far as give and take in turnovers and possessions, and simply make this into a slog. If this comes down to a 1-score game, we know we can trade out at the end. And I think that's been such a fantastic sort of place of confidence for this DC team.
Also, the entire division has just started playing DC Breeze Ultimate. They're all bad at hucking the disc. They all have possessions that last a million throws. So that is the East meta that has emerged in this post Ryan Osgar Empire team as well. They're all 3 are bottom 10 in the league in huck percentage. That's just not their game. It is really interesting how they all, in some ways, it looks a little different for each team, but in some ways DC, New York, and Boston all kind of play just this small ball style of Ultimate now.
What we need to do in the off season is go through an entire long form episode of talking about what each stat means, like huck percentage, defensive conversion rate, that sort of thing, because that's one of those stats that you just said, where the 3 teams to first clinch a playoff spot in 2024 are 3 of the worst deep teams in the league.
Oh, we can take this further, because second to last in the league in huck percentage is the Minnesota Wind Chill, who have a stranglehold in the Central Division right now.
Yeah. And then on the flip side of that, and we've talked about before, I've written about it, defensive conversion rate, where Philadelphia currently sits second overall, and yet their defense has been a dumpster fire at certain points of the season as far as slowing down opposing offenses. Yep. I mean, I think they're either worst or second worst in opponent offensive success rate in terms of what they allow opponents to convert at. So just a real bewildering sort of turnaround there.
Yeah, there's some stats you can really make work for you if you want them to, for whatever argument.
Some really work against you. Again, the fact that hucking doesn't really factor in for some of these teams, and yet you look at certain squads like a Seattle, who sort of relies on it to express their volatility and their possible dangerousness, as well as Oakland. There's some real sort of mixed messaging as far as what these numbers are telling us. And I feel like DC is one of those teams who's so firmly established, to your point, this meta of small ball and possessions simply dominates if we can control turnovers and what we're allowing. And again, the Breeze haven't had a double-digit block performance in each of their last 7 games. They did get 12 break scores on 15 attempts for 82% against Montreal. But aside from that, and a performance against Toronto, 2 of the worst offenses in the league this season, they haven't really been super pressuring of opposing offenses in 2024.
I think the defensive side for both teams is going to be really interesting here, because I don't think DC can necessarily affect too much of Carolina's offense, and I also don't think that Carolina's defense is really like, I don't think this is a game that's built for them to be successful defensively. In terms of like generating blocks, it's hard enough to generate blocks against this DC Breeze team anyways, but like when you look at some of the pieces that are rolling out there, like some of their bigger guys who love to like basically shut down the Hut game. Well, there is no Hut game. The Hut game does not exist. So like Drew Swanson, sorry, you're not going to probably go roof anybody for a D in this one, because chances are there's just not going to be a disc thrown deep in your area ever. And if it is, it's probably going to be either on the money or overshot, because I feel like that happens a lot with the DC Breeze, and is the ones that miss, they're thrown too far. So it's really weird. Like the Flyers struggled to generate blocks last week against Atlanta. When you think about how good Atlanta's offense is at possessing a disc and taking the right shots, and then you kind of look at DC, who's arguably even better at making sure they're taking the right look and making the right shots, like it doesn't spell like a whole lot of success in my mind for the Carolina D-line. And we know you can't just rely on DC to screw it up and throw the disc away, because that's just not what they do. So I am anticipating a game with very few breaks. I that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be like super high scoring. I could see possessions taking a while, but I don't anticipate a game where you're going to see like 5 or 6 breaks from a team. I think we're going to see a pretty clean game offensively from both teams, and it's probably going to come down to just one or two moments in the game where one offense just falters a little bit, but that's all that's going to need to happen for the other team to kind of get a foothold and kind of put their imprint on the game.
I'm going to list 2 X factors for each team, and I just want you to give me some quick thoughts about it. For Carolina, Jacob Fairfax, he's been real dominant in these matchups against DC, and we've often talked about it before. DC's defense does struggle to have kind of an identifiable big defender. I mean, that was their sort of Achilles heel in their East Division Championship game loss last season. And the last time out against DC, I believe Daniel Cohen wrote about it in his Players to Watch article out now in the Watch UFA website. Fairfax had 500 plus receiving yards in his last matchup against the Breeze. I'd need to double check that real quickly, but he's been on an absolute tear in his past 3 games in this season. Let me see. No, that was not correct. Sorry. He had just 258 yards, 3 goals and 2 blocks though last season at DC. And he's just been, again, like a difference maker in virtually every start that he's been available for the Flyers. As well as him, in addition to him, I wanted to also list Suraj Madaraju on the Carolina defense, just because he's historically been one of their top handler defenders. And in this specific matchup against throwing heavy DC offensive lineup, he just kind of figures to have an outsized role in helping in Carolina's successes. And then on the flip side for DC, to me, it comes down to Cole Jurek, who has been the clear team MVP for DC this season, if not a top 3 MVP candidate in the league this year for his both lines play and just sort of complete production effort for the Breeze this season. And then with the absence of Tyler Monroe, I feel like this has to be a big Jacques Nissen game. He came in after winning college championship at the end of the May. He looks like one of the most comfortable players on the field, regardless of situation, moment, matchup, whatever, that I've seen in this league in my time. And this just kind of feels like a moment where they need him to elevate a little bit above what he's normally just capable of producing in his rhythm.
Yeah, you kind of saw that. So that game that they kind of had a scare up in Montreal, he seemed pretty calm the whole time, even when they were, looking like they surely were going to lose before, grabbing victory from the jaws of defeat there. Dude, you could put Fairfax on any list of anything positive, and I'm all in. I think Fairfax is Jacob Fairfax is the best athlete in the league, hands down, in my opinion. He is just an absolute freak of nature. If I was running a team that he was on, I would run everything through him. I would I would diagram so many plays for him. Like, this dude is just like, I don't fanboy over ultimate players. Okay. Like, when I was in college, I didn't even know I didn't care. I was just like, I'm out there to score goals on you and like get open on you all day. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you did in college. I don't care, whatever. I will fanboy over Jacob Fairfax. Like, that dude is incredible. Like, when I see some of the things he does, I almost feel like he's underutilized. Like, and he still puts up like amazing numbers and like seems to be involved in so much stuff. And then I'm always left thinking, I feel like he could have been used more. Like, I feel like he could be affecting things more. So yeah, X Factor. Yeah, he's an end of quarter maniac too. Like, he is up there with the best of them. Like, Jeff
Top
Babbitt,
5, if not top 3.
Yeah.
He's won, I think, the South Division's player awards for best buzzer beater athlete in each of the last 2 or 3 seasons.
and I don't even think it's close in that division. Like, because really, it's just like
Hallsmeyer. Hallsmeyer makes it a little bit closer right now. Just a little bit. I know that Fairfax has kind of the highlight reel potential, but Hallsmeyer's up there as far as just a body you want in space and those kinds of things.
Sure, but end of quarter, it's Jacob Fairfax's disc.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, and I'm blanking on it, but some opponent recently said that he was questioning in a recent Tuesday Toss article by Evan Lepler about why isn't Fairfax a part of more MVP discussions, and I think it's an absolutely valid question to ask.
Yeah, he like I said, I feel like he could be used more, but like, they're so talented that he doesn't need to be, I guess, all the time. Like, if you dropped him on 22 out of the 24 teams in the league, I feel like he would just be a focal point of everything you do. But you have him on an O-line with guys like Anders Jungst and Alan Laviolette and some of these other players. It's just kind of like, yeah, he doesn't have to do everything, but he can if you need him to. I think Siraj Maharaj is a good pick too, especially with this like handler-centric DC Breeze team, like a guy who's going to be tasked with trying to slow down the flow that they have and trying to disrupt this 20 to 30 throw possessions that they have sometimes. Like, he's a good one too. Cole Jurek, man, I think 1 or 2 games this year have been a little bit like, I thought he played pretty poorly, but they were early on in the season. Like, I think he had a great game in Salt Lake, but man, he has really kind of been on a heater since the early part of the season. He really kind of came out in like week 4, maybe it was, when he had his like first really big performance. And I was just like, he was a guy who didn't actually play a ton last year. I think he was hurt for part of the season. And then like when he did play, it was like almost exclusively in a D-line role, I think. And he just like didn't really see the field a lot last year. So he's really put his imprint on this season. Like, he's really become a big time player for them. And he was a guy who was a big time player up in Minnesota. So I'm not surprised at all that he's able to go down there and do something similar in DC. So I think that one's a great pick for DC. But I really am going to be more interested in what he does on the defensive points he played. Because as I mentioned earlier, I think like it's going to come down to just like one or two extra breaks. Because I wouldn't be surprised if this game saw less than 8 breaks total combined between the two teams. So I think every time you can cross him over, every time these teams can maybe cross somebody over who can put a little bit more punch on their D-line, like, I'd love to see Fairfax, to your point of him being an X factor, I'd love to see him on some D-lines, because he's probably the best defender in this game. Like, if you just task him with going out there and playing defense, I don't think there's a player on either team I would trust more or expect more to be able to go out and generate a block than that guy.
He's led the Flyers in multiple seasons in takeaways despite being an offensive starter, to your point. And I've talked about on the show before, I feel like anecdotally, he's the best player in the league at earning blocks back after an offensive turn. Like, to the point of what I mentioned earlier, the Reese Bergeron block, the flying block in 2021, DC turned it over like 3 throws after that because Jacob Fairfax went head level and injured himself to get a layout block to earn the disc back for Carolina. Like, he's just different, man. But I just wanted to point on one thing for how utilitarian and versatile Cole Jurek has been for DC in 2024. In 2023, he only started in 8 regular season games, to your point about him missing some action. He was still mostly on offense, but he felt very within the system of the Breeze. He was kind of a more conservative thrower. I think in Minnesota, we were used to seeing him in the continuation game, kind of stretching the field as both a thrower and a receiver. In DC, in his first season, he had that capability at times. He did have some good huck looks, but it wasn't really within his rhythm, and they weren't really using him in an activated role. This year, though, I mean, he's been doing everything. And to that point, in 7 straight starts, he's played at least 5 defensive points. And in 2 of their most crucial wins, that walk-off win against Philadelphia on May 18th, and then their come-from-behind win at Montreal just a week and a half ago, he's played 30-plus points in those games. And as you know, the 30-point threshold in the modern UFA is just one of the most taxing things to even sort of try to comprehend, let alone understanding somebody who's splitting time between both offense and defense doing that kind of work.
Yeah, 30 points is a lot.
Yeah. But we're already over an hour into this episode, so we need to get into the other handful of matchups that we wanted to talk about in this preview pod. And I'm going to kind of open it up into more of a potpourri segment about these other 5 or so games. I think most notably is the Friday matchup between 6-1 Minnesota and 5-3 Chicago. That's the number 1 seed in the Central Division versus the number 2. Minnesota did win their first matchup this season, 16-14 at Chicago. So they have shown that they're able to win on the road against the Union. But the Union look like, despite some of their deficiencies, one of the more deep and committed teams. I want to use deep a little lightly here, but they have an active 20 that continually responds to the strategies that head coach Dave Woods and the rest of that staff implement in a way that I don't think many teams do in this league. I think that's why they won their game down in Austin in May. I think that's why they gutted out the win against Indy this past weekend against you guys. I think that's why they won against Madison a couple weeks ago. You know, again, they've got 5 wins and they've got some pretty quality ones against divisional and interdivisional opponents. So that's an interesting matchup. We've got 5-3 Madison at 3-4 Indy. I'm sure you can talk a little bit about that one. We've got 3-5 Colorado at 7-2 Seattle. If Colorado loses that game, it will both basically eliminate them from playoff contention, as well as punching the tickets for Seattle and Oakland ostensibly. We've got 6-2 Atlanta at 5-4 Austin. That game isn't so much interesting as far as playoff results, but I think it's a big opportunity for Austin to show anyone what they're capable of before they possibly make the playoffs. They just do not have a quality win to their name outside of defeating interstate opponents from Houston and Dallas, who have just 4 wins combined between them, with Houston's 4 wins all coming against Dallas. And then we've also got 5-2 Oakland at 3-6 San Diego. Much like Colorado, San Diego is basically on life support. They need help to stay in the playoff race. They are a single game basically away from elimination. And on the flip side, if Oakland can win that matchup, they are all but confirmed for their first playoff appearance since 2017. So I kind of want to give you the space to maybe pick and choose where you want to start in that myriad of matchups.
Oh, goodness. Let's start with Minnesota and Chicago. Just because it's a 1 versus 2 matchup. Seems like the place to start. Minnesota down, notably Matt Rader, Quinn Snyder, looks like Tanner Barkas is out. They really struggled in the deep game last week. They were 2 for 11 hucks. They didn't have Rader or Snyder last weekend either. That does obviously present a number of problems. They're still down, as we talked in the pre-show, Sam Berglund, who, when I talked to him at the earliest, Sam Berglund would not be back until probably the last regular season game. which makes it even more important for them to maybe get that first round bye to give him even more time if he needs it to come back from injury. This is a really interesting one because Chicago has been a little bit up and down. They lose the home game to Pittsburgh. They beat us basically in the same way that they lost to Pittsburgh. They kind of flipped the script on what happened in that game. I anticipate it to be really windy in that Chicago stadium. And not that Minnesota is not used to playing in wind, but the wind that they're going to face there, I think the first time they played, there was definitely some wind. It didn't look like maybe it was as windy. But these last two Chicago home games have been pretty crazy. So I think Chicago is learning a little bit better how to take advantage of the wind. The big thing you can't do in games like this, though, is the short field turnovers. It's what doomed Chicago, and it's what doomed us last week in Chicago. And I think that's literally this isn't something that shows up on a stat sheet. You kind of have to watch or like go through the point by point to see like how many throws they had before they turned the disc over. But I think it's really just going to come down to which team has less short field turnovers. That's essentially what happened in our game last week and what happened in the Pittsburgh-Chicago game the week before. The team who was able to at least get it down the field before they turned it was more successful and ended up winning the game. The team that had the most turnovers kind of like in your own red zone, like your defending red zone or near there, was the team that lost. It's a pretty easy equation. With Minnesota not having a couple of deep options, I wonder if they'll be shooting deep less. But because if they shoot deep less and have more of those early, point turnovers that are close to the goal line, that could be a big issue for them. They are the second worst hucking team in the league. I don't see it getting better down their two biggest deep threats. And in their last game, it was really low scoring. I think you said it was 16-14 final score. I remember watching that game, and Minnesota struggled to connect on deep shots in that game. Remember a couple of really bad overthrows when they were going downwind. And I favor Minnesota just because they've been the best team in the division all season, and I think they deserve the benefit of the doubt. But I think Chicago definitely could sneak this one out. I think with the windy conditions, they're a good enough team. I think they're figuring out well enough how to use it that Chicago could definitely knock Minnesota off in this one.
Yeah, I think Chicago was really close in their first matchup this season. Again, they only lost by 2 goals. They only mustered 14 total goals in that matchup, losing 16-14 against the reigning divisional champs from Minnesota. But to what I was saying at the beginning of this segment, Chicago just has a discipline to the kinds of strategies that they want to run, particularly on defense, that is just daunting for a lot of UFA teams. I mean, again, we saw it against Austin. We saw it this past weekend against you guys. We saw it against Madison. The Union have an ability defensively to flummox opposing offenses. They're still top 3 in the league this season in lowest opponent offensive success rate. And I think that's a big credit to both their individual defenders and how they're playing as a unit, as well as how the coaching staff identifies any given possession of an opposing offense. Like, they simply just don't really allow you to get up off the mat and play how you want to play on offense. They don't allow you to get into rhythm. They're going to roll or pull. They're going to trap you on the sideline and double team you on your first throw. They're going to make you dump. They're going to make you reset. They're going to make you use the width of the field, and they're not going to allow a whole bunch of gainers. And that just, over the course of 4 quarters, frustrates a lot of teams. And so I think, to your point, with Minnesota lacking 2 of their vertical stretchers in Rader and Snyder, they could be in for a little bit of trouble if they can't kind of get that open field dangerousness that they found against Colorado 2 weekends ago, and instead have the kind of power outage that they did against Madison in week 9.
Yeah, I think their defense is honestly perfectly set up to play in like the home environment that they're in, because they want to make you like have to like dump and swing the disc across the field. When it's really windy, it's much harder to get those like quick swings off across the field, because you have to be a little bit more deliberate with those throws, which makes the throw a little slower, which means that by the time you're catching it and you're fully ready to like throw potentially into the wind to go across the field, the defense has reset up and that throw is no longer available. Like, you can't see what you see in a lot of these calmer games where somebody just kind of flicks an OI backhand around the defense to swing it across the field. Because if you do that there, the disc is going to be gone. It's going to be it's going to be out in the lake for like at that point. So I think that's one thing that they definitely started doing defensively that helps them. You know, they've always been a team that I think, like, especially like last year, they started doing a little more, just like trying to a lot of double teams, a lot of trying to like make you go backwards. And that can be dangerous in calm conditions, but in those windy conditions, like, you make people go backwards, it's really hard to like kind of make up that ground somewhere else. So we'll see what ends up coming out on top. I still, like I said, still favor Minnesota. They've been the best team in our division all year. There's no reason I shouldn't favor them, but I think Chicago is definitely good enough to make things interesting and potentially win. It does look like they might be down John Lithgow for a third straight game, which will be a big loss for them. If he's not there, he's an amazing player, and I think completely changes what defenses have to do against their offense. But even without him, certainly capable of taking it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Lithgow has been a linchpin for Chicago this season. They've really missed him over the past couple of games, and if he can be available, will be a big determining factor against Minnesota. And again, if Chicago can get a win, and depending on by how much, if they get it by 2 or greater goals, they might sit just a half game behind Minnesota for a potential first seed in the division. And the Wind Chills still have a remaining matchup against the New York Empire, who, as we talked about much earlier on this show, are gaining their mojo week by week at this point.
Yeah. And it would just be a huge like step for Chicago in like clinching a playoff spot too. Like, Chicago sits at the 2 seed right now, but like with how close Madison is with them, with the fact that like even us, like with our schedule, the differences in our schedules between what they have left and what we have left, like it's still pure chaos. Like a loss, it looks like on paper right now would not be that terrible for them, losing to the top team, but like that would put them at 4 losses, which would give them the same amount of losses as Pittsburgh, the same amount of losses as us in Indy. So they'll be 9 games in their season, 4 losses. I don't know. Like, it seems like 7 wins right now in the Central might be the number. Like, you get to 7, you're probably safe, but the only real way to guarantee at this point is to get to 8. So every loss is going to ring pretty big at this point in the Central.
Yeah. But, I think even more pivotal is in the West with, again, these Colorado at Seattle and Oakland at San Diego, because if either Colorado or San Diego lose their matchups, they effectively punch the tickets for their opponents.
Yeah.
So I think that those will be some really key matchups to watch, and especially given how Colorado is sort of getting a little bit more roster consistency and some of their bigger play starters available in their lineup, as well as just how hard of an out San Diego is. These aren't going to be easily winnable games for either Seattle or Oakland.
Well, you say that, and then I look at the Colorado Summit roster, which I think this is different than when I looked at it before. They have 4 notable absences in their game this weekend in Seattle.
Oh, no.
Jay Frood, Jonathan Nethercutt, Saeed Simran, and who was the other one I was looking at? Chance Cochran.
Yeah, I mean, those are considerable, but given how Colorado has functioned without Nethercutt in a variety of games this year, and given the fact that Semrin has had some games with a little bit of turnover problems, I'm not as concerned, given that Colorado does have a certain amount of depth. And again, just given the fact that Thoresen, Feiner, and Nandaman Fink, who have basically been their biggest offensive contributors outside of Alex Atkins, they're all available. And Noah Kuhlman, who has been on a real tear since he struggled with turnovers earlier in the season, he's coming more into his form. I don't disagree with you that obviously the names that you listed are going to have an impact in this matchup, I just think that Colorado still has enough available to make themselves sort of the contenders that they want to be.
I think Seattle wins this game and they complete 80% of their hucks.
Okay. As we talked about coming into the show, I think the thing that's been most surprising about Seattle's successes is the fact that they've been doing it without Khalif El-Salam elevating to some kind of, dominant superstar level. I think I said in one of our preseason preview pods that if Seattle was going to have a big season, I would kind of expect El-Salam to be a dark horse MVP candidate. And yet he's been available. He's been great when he's been active, but he hasn't been a central part of this team's successes. It's been a real story of true offensive and defensive elevation for this Cascades team. And I think that that's just such a credit to their coaching staff, as well as, again, the additions that they brought on, and as well as what roles the players that were already in elevated positions have adapted to. Garrett Martin is still as effective as he was last year when he was one of the top scorers in this league, and he's again in 2024, but he's more choosing his spots. He's not as just sort of manic in his production mode as he was in 2023. Same with Zeppelin Ronig. He's become this more streamlined, effective downfield receiver version of what he's already been building on the past couple of seasons, but he's not exceeding himself and needing to have these outsized performances in order for Seattle to succeed. And I think that goes for almost any one of their individual performers. It feels like there's a handful of players in any given Cascades win that sort of elevate and propel them.
Yeah, like Jack Brown's been having a great season too. I mean, I feel like you could go down the list. Like, the thing that has been most impressive about Seattle to me,
Lucas Ambrose leads the league in blocks again this year.
Yeah. I'm not that surprised, I guess, that they're 7-2, especially when you look at their schedule. I think that makes sense to me. Like, even preseason, if I would have just really looked at their schedule and looked at their first 9 games, and you said they're going to win 7 games, I could totally see it. But it is the way.
Come
no.
You're
because
saying that in retrospect.
No. Because you look at we talked about this in the pre-show. They don't really have a mark. The only team with a winning record they've beaten is Oakland
in the second weekend of the season by 1 goal.
So when you think of it that way, if you would have told me they're going to win their San Diego matchups, I would not have batted an eye, because coming into the season, you and I were both pretty low on San Diego. Their Portland matchups, obviously, if you would have told me they would have beaten Oakland, that wouldn't have shocked me that much, considering how up and down Oakland was last year, and I was picking them to make the playoffs probably above Oakland, right? I was on record saying I thought Seattle was going to be was my favorite out of the other teams to be the third playoff team. So, when you look at who they've beaten, it's been the teams at the bottom of the division and the teams and they have 1 win against Oakland. And, LA turned out to not be as good as we thought, but I thought Seattle could beat LA. So I wouldn't have been shocked if you told me they would have 7 wins. I don't know that I would have gotten the 7 games correct, but
okay, but to complicate that, would you have been shocked if I told you that their 8th win might propel them into first place in the division?
Yes, simply because I would expect Salt Lake.
Because if they win and Salt Lake loses, the Cascades will be
Salt
the
Lake was
first
going to run the
seed in the
table.
West.
Or I thought Salt Lake was going to go 11-1. I was on the record as saying I thought they were going to go 1-1 against Colorado, which did happen, although not the way I anticipated. And I thought that they would go 11-1, 10-2 at the worst if they lost to New York. But after the New York absences, I thought, Salt Lake's going to go 11-1. They're going to win this division. But the thing that has been the most shocking to me isn't that they're 7-2. The thing that's most shocking, like you said, is the way that it's happened. It's been while there are some statistical leaders, it has been a complete team effort. The throwing talent that they have out there this year has been incredible. They lead the league in huck percentage, and it's 73%. So when I said they're going to complete 80% of their hucks, that's not a meteoric gap between where they are and where I'm saying they're going to be in this game. 73% in a 9-game sample size from a team that hucks the disc a good amount. It's pretty impressive. And, they're going to be missing Derek Murad this weekend. So, like, that is a big, and Mark Munoz are both out. Those are big misses for them, obviously. But this is a team. This isn't just, I feel like last year it was a lot of the Khalif and Garrett Martin show. Like,
And Zepp and Jack Brown, as you mentioned as well. Yeah.
And
yeah,
like,
but it was star driven, to your point.
Yes. Like, those two were leading the show. Jack Brown and Zeppelin Ronig were great, but like, I feel like there was a clear focal point on like those two players. And it doesn't feel like that. Like, they have gone out in games without, like, their home loss to Oakland by 1 goal, where they were like playing pretty well. That was a game without Khalif. Like, I feel like last year, when they were down, the games they were down Khalif, I almost just like kind of wrote them off. Like, you don't even have a chance to win this game. But it's
well, even when they had Khalif, his best performance was at home in week 7, I think, against LA, and they lost that in a shootout.
Yeah, and I just don't think it's that anymore. Like, they seem like a complete team. They seem very deep. Guys 1 through 20 going out there. Obviously, the addition of Lucas Ambrose helps, but they had a bunch of additions like Christian Olsen. You were talking about Aaron Wolf in the pre-show and how he sneakily has been kind of like maybe a player we should be talking about more, but like it's also hard because he's playing really well and does a lot of things that I think fill in gaps that they were missing before. But it seems like the whole team's doing that. So it's like
Spencer Lofink has maybe been my candidate for most improved this year. I mean, he's got a 95% completion rating. He's, I think, 2nd or 3rd on the team. In total scores, he's 3rd behind Garrett Martin and Zeppelin Ronig, who are 2 of the league leaders. Lofink is 2nd on the team in total completions. He's completing 70% of his hucks. Like, he's been fantastic. And to your point, we could keep going. Like, there's Jasper Dean, a rookie who is 2nd on the team in blocks with 14, a big presence and a big defender for the defense. You've got Mikey O'Brien coming over from Pittsburgh, having 10 assists, 10 goals, and 11 blocks through his first 9 starts at Seattle.
Cedar Hines, baby.
Cedar Hines, the best name in the league right now. I love that name. Apparently his brother is named Ocean Hines, so props to that family for their choice in names. Just some real West Coast sort of there's that one school who doesn't give grades, Evergreen College. It's that kind of vibe from them. No, fantastic names. Tony Goss in his 2nd season. He's one of those players. Tony Goss is one of those players who was put into an accelerated role as a rookie for a team that was still finding its footing and just had too much to deal with adjusting to the learning curve of the professional league. But in his 2nd season, he's got 10 blocks. He's completing 95% of his throws. He's a real active part of the counterattack. He's been a real pressure kind of defender in the handler space. He's playing fantastic. Aaron Wolf, like you mentioned, has just been a settle down, cleanup fish kind of stabilizer to this entire lineup. A rookie, but a very established player coming over from Germany. There's a handful of other players we can mention. I mean, it just keeps going with the Seattle roster at a certain point. And I think that they need this win against Colorado because it would be sort of the full coming of age of what they've been building towards, right? Like they would clinch a playoff spot and they would put a team down that entering into the season we thought had visibly more talent than the Cascades.
Yeah, 100%. And I just can't speak highly enough to like the complete turnaround. Like this is one of the most stark year-to-year turnarounds I think we've seen. And it just looks like there's complete buy-in too. Like they have the belief and the results are starting to go along with it. Like we mentioned in our pod earlier this week. And they're fun to watch too. Like
oh man, they've been fun to watch since last year when they were just kind of the star highlight driven show.
Yeah. It's a little different when it's like last year it was like, this is either going to be amazing or a train wreck. And this year it just feels like it's just amazing. And they really control their own destiny to the 1 seed. That's the thing, right? Because they play Salt Lake in their only matchup later in the last week of the season, I think. So, like, the 1 seed is 100% theirs to go grab. And this week would be obviously a big step towards doing that, because first off, it would give them a win against a Colorado team that we have a lot of respect for despite their record. And I think it's just like that next stepping stone to like getting to try to knock off Salt Lake. And man, wouldn't that be a story? Like, if they were able to win this weekend and go on and beat Salt Lake and take the 1 seed, I mean, that would be something that I don't even know if Seattle Cascades players, if they were being completely honest, would have said that they thought was going to was even possible this year.
Yeah. I mean, it's been a complete turnaround. To your point, I mean, I think to also your point, like 7-2, given their schedule and quality of opponent, isn't entirely shocking. I think it's also the fact that they've had multiple double-digit wins to this point in the season.
Blowing
like
teams
they're
out.
just punching down on teams that they can take advantage of.
Yeah. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the rest of the schedule. We've already been going so long, but I do want to touch on 3 more games, and I'm just going to go real quick, just like thoughts. So Madison at Indy. Madison, we've talked before. Their record looks pretty good. They're at 5-3, but 4 of those are against Detroit and Pittsburgh. So this would go a long way for Madison if they were able to beat us this weekend and like kind of legitimizing their record a little bit more. And for us, we have 2 games against Madison. Winning this first one, putting us at 4-4. We are still in control of our playoff destiny, and winning this weekend is kind of the way to keep it that way. If we were to lose this game, it's not impossible that we make the playoffs by any stretch of the imagination, but we basically put ourselves in a win every game or else we're out of the playoffs mode. So this game, a little more crucial for us than it is for Madison, but it really does feel like whoever wins this game is really might be putting themselves in the driver's seat for the 3rd playoff spot, as it looks like Chicago even though Chicago has the same record as Madison, they're a little bit more secure. Madison's down Pat Schreiwise again. Be interested to see what that looks like. They definitely can't afford to have another 7+ turnover game from Kai Marcus. I think that would be extremely detrimental to their chances of winning this game. So that'll be the thing to look for. If you wanted to look at the box score to tell the story of the game, what do Kai Marcus's numbers look like might be the most indicative of like who wins this game. Oakland, San Diego. Oakland can essentially wrap up a playoff spot if they win this weekend. So they took care of business against San Diego last week. They're traveling to San Diego. They look to have, about their strongest lineup they could put out there. So mostly at full strength, it looks like, for both teams. San Diego has continued to be punchy. At this point, their playoff chances, I know you said they're technically still alive, but it is one of those every single thing has to go right for them to make the playoffs. So right now, it's more about messing up playoff chances for somebody else. However, Oakland's looked really good. They looked pretty convincing in their win last week, I think, at San Diego, and I would expect that to continue. And the last one quickly is just Atlanta and Austin. Austin has been largely non-competitive in their games against non-Dallas, non-Houston teams. And even in their most recent Dallas game, they let Dallas hang around for a long time before finally putting them away. I would love to see Austin finally punch up and be competitive with Atlanta or Carolina, as they haven't been this year. But Atlanta's just playing so well right now. This game seems so far out of the reach of the Soul. We know the Soul have the ability to punch up with Atlanta, but they just haven't shown it this year. So, Atlanta, I think, clinches a playoff spot if they win this weekend. So even though the South, we feel like we know who the playoff teams are, no one's officially clinched yet. So this would be the step for Atlanta clinching. And also Atlanta still has a decent shot at taking home the 1 seed. So if they want to do that, they're going to have to win this game.
I concur with all your points. I think Atlanta right now is a runaway freight train, and have to give credit to Evan Lepler as far as calling me out a couple weekends ago about maybe placing them first in the power rankings. But until they defeated Carolina, couldn't really let them leapfrog an undefeated Flyers team, given how they were performing through the first half of their season. But yeah, I feel like Atlanta's a little bit out of stress for Austin. I feel like Madison has a little bit more breathing room than you guys in Indy. But at the same time, I feel like Madison can't quite afford to continue to have the slip-ups against in-division opponents as they've had the past couple of seasons. Again, if they allow sort of the Colorado win to buoy themselves over the other failures that they've had now, if they lose to you guys and then Minnesota and Chicago, that's just going to kind of put them back in the trailer seat that they've been in since 2018.
Yeah.
And then most notably, I just wanted to address Oakland's road trip, because there's just too many sort of existential screaming noises coming from me about how they had a similar opportunity in 2023 entering their final regular season weekend, going for a SoCal road trip. It was reversed. They had LA first, and then they faced San Diego in the second of their back-to-back doubleheader. They faced San Diego first on Saturday night, and then they face LA on Sunday this coming weekend. But the Spiders are 7-3 and only had to win one game last year, and they just couldn't pull it off. And I do feel like that they have pieces in place this year to help them overcome that. I do feel like they've strangely found a success in the aggregate after losing Mac Hecht, where Jason Valley, Eli Kearns, and some of their other additions as far as the rookies that they've added, Dylan Burns and Aiden Curry come to mind, but also just the sort of full roster participation that Dan Silverstein and that coaching staff does such a good job of getting out of the Spiders is a little bit more elevated this year. But I do just have trepidation and skepticism about them being able to close out. This has not been a quality of this Oakland team for several seasons. And so to me, they've got to show that they can win that game in San Diego. The Growlers are not, they are the maybe most deserving team in this league as far as they're not just going to give it to you. I mean, other than that blowout loss that they had in their first matchup of the season at Seattle against a Cascades opponent that I don't think that they quite understood what they were preparing for in the moment, the Growlers have been one of the toughest outs in the league this season. And so I think that Oakland has a pretty big task ahead of them on the road, but they can get it done. To your point, I do believe in the roster that they're assembling. So
yeah, and I think it's good for them that they have the San Diego game first, as that definitely, seems to be the matchup that would be more difficult. If you have a doubleheader weekend, you always want to do the more difficult game first. You would really prefer not to play the more difficult team on those tired legs. I think at the end of this weekend, we are going to be saying that Oakland is 7-2 and that they are in the playoffs, because I think Oakland's going to win both games, and I'm picking Seattle in that Seattle-Colorado game. So I think we're officially going to have our three teams locked in after this weekend in the West.
The real question is, are you saying, though, that Seattle will be in first place and that Oakland and Salt Lake will be in a virtual tie for second in the West at 7-2? I mean, I know it's this trend. They will hold the head-to-head advantage because they did win by 6 in Oakland earlier this season. Yep. But it will still be the full return of the Wild Wild West.
I guess in that sense, because I do favor New York, I would say it is going to be Seattle, Salt Lake, Oakland.
Yeah, almost with Oakland sitting idle.
That is wild to say out loud.
Yeah. Again, chaos season, baby. Chaos season.
Chaos indeed.
But that should do it for this episode and Week 10 preview pod. Again, you should absolutely tune in this weekend on both the UFA YouTube on Saturday, midday, 1 p.m. Eastern for the Super Series matchup and a rematch of the 2023 championship game between Salt Lake and New York. But there are 13 other games available, and that game available as well. 14 total games, all on Watch UFA TV, live. You're definitely going to want to tune in. Again, we've only got 3 of the 12 playoff spots confirmed on the East Division, so there's a lot of work to be done throughout the rest of the league. Cam and I will be tuning in along with you. We will talk to you in just a couple of days to recap all the action. Swing Pass will bid you adieu for now, but we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
The UFA Super Series delivers a must-see showdown on Saturday, June 29th, when the Salt Lake Shred and New York Empire reunite for a rematch of last year's championship game. The Shred determined to make a high-flying statement against the reigning champs, who are hosting their first game ever at Trinity Health Stadium in Hartford. Hope you'll join us for the next thrilling chapter between Salt Lake and New York, Saturday, June 29th at 1 p.m. in the UFA Super Series.